Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I'm Bob Allison. I chair Rev 250, which is a consortium of 75 organizations in Massachusetts planning commemorations of the beginnings of American independence. And behind the curtain is Jonathan Lane, our executive director, and with us is John R. Maass. John, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And we're here to talk about your latest book, which I believe is your sixth, From Trenton to Yorktown, Turning Points of the Revolutionary War. But let me also say that you are an historian, educator at the National Museum of the United States Army at Fort Belvoir in Fairfax County, Virginia. It must be in Fairfax County, since as you were saying, the Fairfaxes were there. So thanks for joining us, John.
Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
So your book looks at 5 turning points, but I think first, why don't we ask you, what exactly is a turning point?
Okay, well, thanks, Bob, for having me, and appreciate the opportunity to talk about the book. What I'll do is I'll read my definition of turning point, and I think that'll help explain as we go along kind of where I was coming from, where I start from. Folks who read the book will be able to see that in the introduction, but my definition of a turning point in this case is that it is a battle, campaign, siege, and other military events that are decisive and result in significant change that alters the trajectory of the conflict toward the war's outcome. So to kind of distill that even more, the turning point, in my definition, is not just a big battle or heavy casualties, or maybe somebody retreats or loses one of the states, but an event that alters the trajectory of the war toward its ultimate outcome, which in this case is American independence. Mm-hmm. So, for example, the Battle of Brandywine in 1777, mm-hmm. the British beat Washington's army, forced mm-hmm. him to retire, maneuvered him out of Philadelphia, captured the putative capital of America, and forced Washington away from the city. What did that do? Well, mm-hmm. the Americans didn't surrender, and the British actually left Philadelphia about 8 or 9 months later, and so therefore it really did not alter mm-hmm. the trajectory of the war. Whereas the 5 events that I talk right. about, they do significantly alter that.
That's a good way of putting it, and that leads us to your third chapter is on the consequences for Washington after losing Brandywine and Philadelphia, is the winter at Valley Forge. And you see that is one of the turning points for a number of reasons. Why don't we talk about Valley Forge, since we're on Pennsylvania at the moment?
Sure. So to continue with that story, the British occupied Philadelphia. There was a subsequent Battle of Germantown, which was mm-hmm. another British eked out a victory at the end in the fourth quarter, and mm-hmm. Washington had to kind of maneuver away and retire to the encampment mm-hmm. at Valley Forge. Now, most Americans know, at least they know, Valley Forge was in the wintertime. So, yeah. And there's kind of 2 sides to Valley Forge. One of them is the one we've really all heard and familiar with, where the troops are in roughly 17,000 or so troops were at Valley Forge. And the Americans needed to feed them, supply them, but also to train them. Mm-hmm. And so along comes the famous Baron von Steuben. Lots of people say he wasn't a baron, but there was for a time he occupied a position in a very small army of a very mm-hmm. small principality, and was given a title which the British would have called baron. So technically, see manager for details, read the fine print. But he was for real as far as a soldier. There's zero doubt about that. Mm-hmm. Zero doubt. And he was a Prussian, spoke French and German, and what he did was he came in and simplified things for the mm-hmm. Americans. These were not professional soldiers in 1777 right. and 1778. So he simplified the drill. He simplified the firings from about 25 steps that the British Army had to fire a musket to about 10 or 11. He trained them how to march, but also sanitary conditions in camp, where to dig the latrines in relationship to your tent, things along those lines. And so the American Army that emerged from Valley Forge, it might be a little bit too much to say they were professional in the sense of the French and the Prussians and the British, but they certainly were a lot better trained, a lot better disciplined. Their officers were better now. And just to give you an example, one of the things in the 18th century was you had to be able to maneuver troops together on the battlefield. And so that seems so simple now, but anybody who's been in the Army or the Marines or and even marching band in high school, you got to be able to move bodies of people effectively. And so try to figure out, how would you move a column of troops marching down the road into a line of battle on both sides of that road, then advance, fix bayonets and charge. That's not intrinsically known to the average recruit in America in 1778. And one of the ways we see how effective von Steuben and his lieutenants were in the training was how well the Americans did at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse in June of 78 after they left Valley Forge. Now, the second part of Valley Forge is Washington and several of his commanders and allies were convinced that there was a group of people against his command called a cabal. We don't really use that word much today. I think we should. It's a lot of fun.
Probably,
And but Washington and others were dead set convinced that there were congressmen and generals at the capital of York, Pennsylvania, who did not want to see him in command anymore. He had been defeated at Brandywine, and all of a sudden you have this guy show up in York named Horatio Gates, who had just won the battles of Saratoga. So Washington did a very smooth, what's the right word, a savvy move in that he invited a congressional committee to the camps at Valley Forge to see the conditions and to let them see with their own eyes how bad things were. And he was very savvy in that he had Alexander Hamilton write up a 16,000 word introductory document to hand Congress and say, here's what we suggest. And once Congress got there, the delegation could clearly see the problems. They worked hard to fix it. It never did get fixed. It got better, but not fixed. And Washington also was able to outmaneuver the generals such as Horatio Gates, Thomas Mifflin, and some congressmen out of their positions. And the way I put it in the book is that his commission that he received from Congress in 1775, his commission was that his rank was general and commander-in-chief. And up until the end of Valley Forge, he had been a general. He had been a general in Boston, Long Island, Trenton, Princeton, Brandywine. But once he consolidated his command of the army, there was no more threats to him after that during the war. He became commander-in-chief. He really did. So those really are the main the reason why I consider Valley Forge a turning point.
Right. We're talking with John Maass, author of From Trenton to Yorktown, Turning Points of the Revolutionary War, which looks at these 5 episodes. And as you were saying, it's not necessarily the battle, it's the campaign. And so actually, I was thinking we could go back then to Saratoga, which is your previous one, where Gates, of course, is the hero. And I think there's probably not going to be any dispute that this is the battle itself is a turning point. Is it?
No, this not at all. And to cut to the chase, and spoiler alert, as they say today, Saratoga really was the biggest turning point
Hmm.
in the war, and I won't really go through the details of the campaign itself, but to get to the turning point, um, an army led by Horatio, initially by Philip Schuyler, then
Right.
Horatio Gates, consisting of Continentals and militia, were able to concentrate to large numbers in the area north of Albany, roughly between Lake George and Albany, and had two battles at Saratoga. The British realized that they were basically not going to make it to their objective, Albany,
Hmm.
and it was too late in the season, and so they surrendered. The British were under Lieutenant General John Burgoyne.
Hmm. And for Burgoyne, this was a big plan. This was going to end the war by launching this invasion from Canada.
Well, it was going to contribute to that. It was half of that.
Yeah.
And you remember the other part was some force was supposed to come up the Hudson toward Albany from New York City.
Right.
And this was a classic case study. And if you read Kevin Weddell's book that came out a few years ago, The Complete Victory, and also Eric Schnitzer's book on the same subject, trying to have the British made the mistake of, instead of concentration of force, which is one of the Army's key strategic elements, they divided the two armies in two, and they purposely developed a plan where the enemy was between the two wings. That's a gigantic no-no, right? That is not the way you do it. And who was the commander overall? A civilian 3,000 miles away who can't see what's going on the ground on some of, if not the most difficult terrain to operate on logistically in all of North America.
It looks a lot easier on a map if you're sitting in London.
It does. It absolutely does. So what was the fallout from that? Well, in Burgoyne's surrender, the obvious one is the Americans knocked out an 8,000-man force of redcoats and Hessians. They were not replaceable. But the real benefit was the alliance with France. There were actually two agreements or two treaties or agreements. One was the Treaty of Amity and Commerce, and the other one was the military alliance. And once the British learned that, the war changed instantly in two ways. And first, the Americans got from that alliance something that they never would have had and never did have, which is a navy. They had a navy that could now go toe-to-toe and better. I won't give away the ending. With the French Navy, all of a sudden the British couldn't move at will troops from Halifax, Nova Scotia to New York, or New York to Charleston. So that was a big difference. And even more, which I think is kind of overlooked by the public, not so much military historians, but now the center of gravity shifted from the 13 colonies, which became the United States, to the West Indies, meaning the Caribbean, because that's where follow the money, right? That's where the money was, down in the Caribbean, the Sugar Islands. And so, as we talked briefly, when the British evacuated Philadelphia in 1778, after that treaty was signed, to move their army back to New York, why were they doing that? They were getting ready to ship out 5,500 redcoats to the West Indies out of New York. They had to protect the West Indies. So that was an enormous change in the tempo, as the Army says now, the battle rhythm of the war. That had now moved, to use another modern term, that moved offshore. That is now West Indies. And when you add French help plus the British withdraw thousands of troops, that was a key game changer right there.
It really was. And of course, then Admiral Rodney, who loses the Battle of the Chesapeake, the following year wins the Battle of the Saints, keeping British control of the West Indies, which to them was probably more important than holding on to these 13 colonies, which did not want to be part of the empire any longer.
Right. And in hindsight, you know, in this by 1781, 82, 83, the merchants and politicians and people who didn't like to get taxed on their estates, they realized everything they wanted to milk out of the 13 colonies, they could do it just as easily and far cheaper without a war going on.
Right.
It was became very obvious.
Yeah. And that was actually part of Washington's overall strategy, was to convince the British public, I think, the British politicians, that they couldn't, why maintain the war?
Yeah, well, Washington and Congress, in a way, I don't want to draw too many close parallels, but in the way the Confederate government thought that if they held on long enough, the North would say, man, the British would say, where's our cotton? Well, this is killing us. And,
that's right.
Same thing. Well, not a similar situation.
Similar, yeah. We're talking with John Maass, historian at the National Museum of the U.S. Army at Fort Belvoir, and the author of, among his 6 books, his latest is From Trenton to Yorktown. You've also written a book about the Yorktown campaign, as well as about George Washington's Virginia and the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, which is really you talk in that chapter about trying to isolate the one decisive battle in that Southern campaign is difficult because there are a lot, and which is the critical one. So why don't we talk a little bit about, what Guilford Courthouse was, and then how you decided this was the crucial one, or both. You can intermingle both, I think.
Well, let me start by saying, and I don't think I really go into this in the book that much, but you and I are old enough to remember the American Heritage Golden Book of the Revolutionary War, and Bruce Lancaster, and even Robert Middlekauf's 1980s contribution to the Oxford History of the U.S., Time Life books, and that, and National Geographic even had one, and in those books, they were structured all the same way. There was a chapter on Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill, then Washington in the New York area, then Trenton and Princeton, then Philadelphia and Monmouth, and a little bit in the West here or there. Nobody really knew where that was or what was going on.
George Rogers Clark was doing something.
Right. Yeah. And then at the end of those books, there was one chapter on everything to do with the South. Right. One chapter.
Yeah.
From Moore's Creek, if that, to Yorktown in one chapter.
Yeah.
Now, none of the books were ever structured on some kind of, quote, northern campaign, right?
No.
But everybody seemed to think that from 1775 through 1783, there was one southern campaign. Okay, absolutely wrong. So that's the first premise we have to defeat. So what I did is I identified what I call the Carolinas campaign of 1780 and 81. And by that, I mean when the British launched their very large invasion from New York in late December of 1780 and landed at Charleston and got Charleston surrender in May of 1780. So from there, that's the beginning of what I consider to be the Carolinas campaign of 1780, 1781. And briefly, the British left a lot of their troops there. Some went back to New York under Sir Henry Clinton. But he left a large contingent, fairly large contingent, under Lieutenant General Lord Cornwallis. And the British fanned out in erected posts and garrisons at several places in South Carolina, cowed the patriots, the loyalists, started enlisting. They also established posts at I'll think of a second, on the Savannah River.
Yeah.
I'll think of it. Augusta, Georgia.
Right.
And so South Carolina was basically, I don't know that I'd use the word conquered, but certainly subdued.
Right.
And so Cornwallis moves north, and he defeats Horatio Gates of Saratoga fame in August of 1780 at the Battle of Camden. And from that point, what does he do? He advances toward his next objective, which is North Carolina. Well, 6 weeks after Camden, some of his militia, about 1,200 of his militia, get defeated by American militia at Kings Mountain.
Right.
And that's one of America's two favorite battles, because it's over mountain men, it's frontiersmen on horseback firing rifles, and they're rugged individualists, and who wouldn't like them, right? And so after that battle, what does Cornwallis do? He advances toward North Carolina. Cornwallis never counted on those loyalist militiamen for his campaign. In fact, that was Clinton's idea, and because Cornwallis actively despised Clinton, he had no intention of making them. He thought they would be useless. So he advances toward Charlotte, North Carolina, and in January of 1781, a detachment of his army of about 800 or 900 men under the feared Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton gets defeated soundly by Daniel Morgan at Cowpens.
Right.
And that's America's second favorite battle, because Daniel Morgan was a homespun hero who somehow pulled off a double envelopment. It was accidental, by the way. And he defeated the hated Tarleton, the Cromwell of the Revolution, if you will, and he lost a lot of men. Cornwallis lost men, redcoats of the 71st, the 7th Regiment, Tarleton's Dragoons. And so what did Cornwallis do after that defeat? He moved into North Carolina.
Right, yeah.
He pushed the rebels out of Charlotte. He forced his way across the Catawba in North Carolina at Cowan's Ford, fought a couple skirmishes. Then he maneuvers the new American commander, Major General Nathaniel Greene, and they meet up at a battle at Guilford Courthouse. It is a Pyrrhic victory for Cornwallis. And what does he do then? He retreats to the coast at Wilmington by the middle of April, and decides he's going to leave North Carolina and go into Virginia. So when Cornwallis leaves Virginia, which he reached by early May, who's in North Carolina? No British, all Americans. So which of those battles, Charleston, Kings Mountain, Cowpens, Cowan's Ford, Shallowford, Weitzel's Mill, Guilford Courthouse, which of those battles really is the one that forced Cornwallis and the British to leave North Carolina? It was Guilford Courthouse.
Right. Okay. We're talking with John Maass, author of From Trenton to Yorktown. I'm wondering, John, as a strategist, I mean, here we are looking at this, and we know what happened. What would you have suggested Cornwallis do instead of invading Virginia? You can either answer this as you're John Maass or if you're Sir Henry Clinton.
I won't associate myself with Sir Henry Clinton. However, I think the answer, Bob, is that they probably never should have invaded North Carolina. First of all, by the time he entered North Carolina, he had 2,200 men.
Yeah.
That's not an invasion. That's a raid. They're not going to subdue anybody.
Yeah.
with 2,200 men from the Outer Banks to the Blue Ridge Mountains. That's just crazy.
Yeah.
And Greene could always move across another river. That was his whole strategy, right? They moved across. Greene kept a barrier between him and Cornwallis until he was numerous enough to turn around and fight. This is a point that Larry Babbitts makes in several of his articles and books. Is when the British got across the Catawba near Charlotte, the Americans retreated across the Yadkin. When Cornwallis crossed the Yadkin, they retreated across the Haw. When Cornwallis approached the Haw, they retreated across the Dan River. And Cornwallis knew, okay, how many rivers does this place have, by the way? And I'm losing men every step of the way. So he went to North Carolina. Unless they sent an 8,000 man Navy-supported expedition in North Carolina, they were never going to do it. Now, I think when he was in Wilmington, sitting in Wilmington, figuring out what to do, he had two choices because Greene moved into South Carolina after Guilford Courthouse.
Right. Yeah, he goes back to South Carolina and holds that.
So why didn't Cornwallis go back there?
Yeah.
The Americans were never going to capture Charleston. It was just too well defended, right at the water. The British had a guaranteed, basically the equivalent of having aircraft carriers sitting next to your.
Yeah.
But when they went into Virginia, they had a fairly large force. I mean, the troops Cornwallis brought with him into Virginia, he only brought 1,500 troops, but he met up with another army under Major General William Phillips at Petersburg, and also got support from other areas to get his strength up to about 6,000 men. But Clinton really didn't send much support down his way. It seemed half-hearted. It seemed, and you'll remember, Cornwallis went to Virginia to wreck Virginia's logistical support for the rest of the South, whereas Clinton's objective was, well, okay, but we really need a good naval base to support Navy operations in the West Indies.
Right. And Charleston's a lot better for that.
So, and Cornwallis, after he raided Virginia, and that's what my book, The Road to Yorktown, is all about, was the pre-Yorktown maneuvers in Virginia. Once he got back down to the Tidewater, he became oddly lethargic, started writing Clinton letters. Hey, what am I supposed to do? What do you want me to do? Okay, I'll wait here. And he wasn't the bold commander that he was from Charleston to Guilford.
Interesting. We're talking with John Maass, author of From Trenton to Yorktown, Turning Points of the Revolutionary War. Why don't we go back to the beginning? I note, by the way, you did not mention, you don't have chapters on Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill, our favorite battles here, but you begin with the 10 crucial days of the Trenton and Princeton campaign.
So is your question, why didn't I include the... No.
I'm curious then about why Trenton, what do you see as the Trenton-Princeton? What's the real decisive thing happening there?
So if you go from Boston to the day before the Battle of Long Island in August of 1776, Washington had a lot of troops, and he had, it's always hard, as most folks know, it's always hard to get a real pin down the numbers of American troops on any given day. But roughly fluctuating, let's say 18 to 20,000 in and around New York City. That includes Long Island, Staten Island, on the New Jersey side, Manhattan. when the New York battle started, then he was defeated at Long Island, also known as the Battle of Brooklyn. Has to leave Manhattan after the British land at Kips Bay and other places. Has a fairly successful day at Harlem Heights, but he still retreated. Had kind of got pushed off of White Plains, and then there were the disasters at Fort Washington and Fort Lee. Washington was losing men every single day he retreated, and he retreated from Hackensack, New Jersey, all the way across northern New Jersey into Pennsylvania, so that by the time he crossed the Trenton, and he had only about 2,500 Continentals. The New Jersey militia was leaving in droves. Americans in parts of Pennsylvania and almost all across northern New Jersey were looking at the situation saying, I don't know about this. I think I'll take the loyalty oath for the British because they seem to be doing pretty darn well here. And so when by mid-December, Washington realized his army was shrinking. Half of his Continentals enlistments were going to expire at the end of December. So he literally had this deadline that if he didn't use his army, he wasn't going to have it on January 1st. So, but he also got a lot of great support, and there's other authors that have been able to write monographs about this that I had to limit my tale because of my chapters. But folks like Larry Kidder and David Hackett Fisher's book on Washington Crossing, Arthur Lefkowitz, folks like that, and others. Bill Welsh's written articles, David Price. I don't want to leave anybody out because there's a lot of good scholarship who helped me on this. But he had to do something. And so he got a lot of support from some key militia commanders and even civilian leaders in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, Cadwalader, Joseph Reed, Thomas Mifflin was there with what have you. And as most folks know, if they haven't read anything about it, they sure as hell have seen the painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. And he crosses. They capture and defeat a garrison of Hessians at Trenton. They go back into Pennsylvania, but then they cross over again. They face off against the British. It's what's called the Second Battle at Trenton, along Assunpink Creek, and then the next day they defeat a detachment of British troops at Princeton. Huge morale boost. The British contract their faulty system of cantonments of their troops all across northern New Jersey, and one of the most interesting things I learned about this campaign is you don't have to leave it to the Americans to tell the story about the effects, because a lot of the British officers and Hessian officers and even Howe wrote themselves about the strategic effect of these victories, even though they're small by Long Island standards and Brandywine standards and Yorktown standards, but Saratoga standards, but very, very decisive. The morale increased, and when Howe got the news, Sir William Howe, the British commander-in-chief in New York City, when he got the news of these defeats, he wrote to Germain not long after and said, "Oh, by the way, I don't think I'm going to be able to win this war in 1777. It's going to take a little bit longer than that and a whole lot more troops."
Wow. And of course, Cornwallis was the general at the Second Battle of Trenton and Princeton, and he has a wonderful toast he gives at Yorktown about how history will record your victory in the Chesapeake, but will note the laurels you won on the Delaware. It's this smaller battle, but it is the decisive one. I'm wondering, John, you mentioned the limitation you have on chapters. So here you have 5. If your editor or publisher said, "Oh, why don't we have 6 or 7?"
Which one, right? Is that
Yeah,
I've been
yeah,
asked
yeah,
this,
yeah.
I've been asked this question before. Uh, well, I stuck with military events.
Yeah.
But folks who have read Larry Ferrero's um, very acclaimed book called Brothers at Arms, the French and the Spanish and the
Hmm.
Revolutionary War, um, Larry takes the position that the Declaration of Independence, in effect, was a military measure which allowed France to recognize another nation
Hmm.
instead of a group of
Right.
colonies in rebellion against the monarchy.
Right.
And as folks can probably figure out, I don't think Louis XVI was really in favor of supporting publicly rebellious citizens who wanted to overthrow the monarch.
Right. Right.
So, and Larry goes into a lot more detail on that, but I think that's kind of a standalone event. I'd call it more of a diplomatic
Hmm.
or political turning point instead of military. But I
Hmm.
was very tempted to include that.
Mm.
But eventually, my discussions with the editors and the publishers, who, by the way, were incredibly supportive of the book. I don't want to imply that there was some kind of a
No.
debate that we disagreed with, but
Yeah. No. Well, it happens. You learn a lot in these discussions with editors and publishers who can look at things
and
with a clear eye.
and agents too.
Yeah.
They also add a lot too. Mine did.
Right. Yeah, well, that's very good. Well, thank you so much. We have been talking with John Maass, author of From Trenton to Yorktown, Turning Points of the Revolutionary War. Anything else we should say, John, before we let you go? I know you have a full-time job.
Well, I hope folks get a lot out of it. I wrote the book to be provocative, not in the sense of saying anything inflammatory, but I mean to provoke discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And my speaking engagements that I've had so far have really done that, and it's been fun because some folks will say, how in the world isn't Bunker Hill a turning point? Well, it might have been, but again, did it turn things toward eventual victory?
Yeah.
But I'm more than willing to talk to, and I wouldn't even say debate, because that implies a conflict or a disagreement necessarily. But I and other people have great ideas. I just hope people get something out of it that makes them think and read more
Great. Very good. Well, thank you so much, John.
Thank you.
We've been talking with John Maass from the National Museum of the U.S. Army at Fort Belvoir, author of From Trenton to Yorktown, Turning Points of the Revolutionary War, along with books about North Carolina in the French and Indian War, a book about defending a new nation, 1783-1811, The Road to Yorktown, George Washington's Virginia, the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. And are you working on anything new?
I am. There is a publisher called West Home Publishing, and they do a lot of good history.
They do.
Fortunately, their publisher is very interested in early American history, which is great. And they have a series called Small Battles of the American Revolution. And so there's 6 of them that have been published so far, and I'm working on the 7th one, which is, no surprise, 2 battles that led to Yorktown, which are Spencer's Ordinary and Green Spring, both of them in Virginia in the Williamsburg area. And I'm hoping to get out. We're hoping, all of us, the publisher, Bruce Franklin, and I and others are hoping to get that out very soon.
Very good. Well, good luck. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate you having me.
Appreciate you being with us. And I want to thank Jonathan Lane, our producer and man behind the curtain, as well as our listeners. Every week we thank folks who are regular listeners. And if you are in one of these places and want some Rev 250 swag, or just want Jonathan to give some ideas to Jonathan, Lane at revolution250.org. And this week I want to thank our listeners in the great state of North Carolina, in Charlotte and in Winston-Salem.
Great.
Here,
Great.
yeah, and here in Massachusetts, in Lexington, and as well as in Woburn and Chicopee, Kirkland, Washington, Brisbane, Australia, Copenhagen, Amman, Tel Aviv, Lafayette, Louisiana, Pensacola, Florida, and all places between and beyond. Thanks for joining us. Now we'll be piped out on the road to Boston.